Greetings, everybody. Howdy and hello. Welcome. My name is Lainey Rose, and I'm the events manager here at East City Bookshop. It's wonderful to be with you all today for both in person and for our virtual attendees if you're watching that way. By show of hands, who's here for the first time in the store? Okay, wow, that is a delightfully small amount. Welcome back to everybody else who's here, returning. It's so wonderful to be with you all. This month is packed as our events and book clubs are back in full swing. Friday night, we're hosting Sarah Reese Brennan for her adult fantasy, Long Live Evil. And later this month, we'll be hosting a very exciting in-store happy hour to celebrate the launch of Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. Sally Rooney won't be there, but we will be. And so will a lot of giveaways. There's a lot of fun stuff that I can't tell you guys about yet, but we have a lot of fun goodies and giveaways and treats and snacks. It'll be a great time. All the information about our upcoming events and book clubs is on our website. Before we get to tonight's event, some housekeeping details. Number one, if you could take a moment to silence your cell phones, we would appreciate it. Number two, if you need a restroom, it's upstairs past the cash registers and the greeting cards. Number three, we will have time for questions tonight for both in person and for our virtual attendees. So even if you're watching via Zoom, you can participate. Please put those questions in the Q&A feature so that we can see them and can ask on your behalf. And finally, most importantly, if you need to purchase a copy of any of tonight's authors, we have the copies available. They're upstairs at the register, and we'd be happy to help you out with that. I am so thrilled that we get to be here tonight to celebrate the launch of Andie Burke's latest novel. Andie is a dear friend of the shop, and we love her dearly, and a great member of our local romance community. Our community really stepped up and helped us recently when we were closed for a month due to a flood that crashed through our ceiling. That's not a joke, that really happened. Not unlike how in Fall for Him, Dylan Gallagher caused a flood, fell through the floor, landed directly on Derek Chang's bed, and made an "It's Raining Men" joke. Luckily, none of our staff members made that joke, but we are making it now that we have the wonderful Fall for Him. Dylan and Derek want to keep the catastrophe quiet, so Dylan offers to help fix the damage himself. But will squeezing their emotional baggage plus a dog into a tiny one-bedroom apartment be a major disaster, or just prove that they're made for each other? Our author of the evening is Andie Burke, who writes books with queer kissing and happily ever afters. She was originally an English major who decided to jump into a pediatric nursing career. Her writing is inspired by over a decade spent working in hospitals with patients of all ages. When she's not writing, you can probably find her feeding snacks to the two small human creatures who live with her, or trying not to kill her chaotic houseplants. Joining us in conversation tonight are our dear friends in the neighborhood, Susie and Jenna. Susie Dumond is a queer writer originally from Little Rock, Arkansas. She's the author of Queerly Beloved and Looking for a Sign and is a senior contributor at Book Riot. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her wife, Mary, and her cat, Maple. When she's not writing or reading, you can find her baking cupcakes or belting karaoke at the nearest gay bar. Jenna Voris is the author of Every Time You Hear That Song in the forthcoming Say a Little Prayer. She was born and raised in Indiana, where she learned to love roundabouts and the art of college basketball, and now calls Washington, D.C. home. When she's not writing, she can be found perfecting her road trip playlists and also desperately trying to keep her houseplants alive. Please welcome our authors of the evening.
Hello. There we go. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Susie. We've got Andie and Jenna here, and we're very excited to talk about the delightful Fall for Him. Andie, can you start by just telling us a little bit about it?
Sure. So Fall for Him starts out with somebody falling. And it basically starts with a catastrophe because I've decided that that is my brand and I begin books with catastrophes. And Dylan, unfortunately, floods his kitchen and he falls directly through the ceiling and lands on his downstairs neighbor's bed. Very unfortunate because this downstairs neighbor is very hot and does not like him at all. He didn't like him even before he caused a catastrophe. So this basically causes a big rigmarole where they've got to figure out what to do because neither of them have the money to fix it right away. That it seems like. And then, so then Dylan and Derek make a deal. Dylan will help Derek keep the secret of the dog if Derek lets him do all the renovation work. And then hijinks ensue.
I love that. I think it's such a fun setup. Also, I was kind of wondering if this book is on a bookshelf, what are the other books that would kind of be around it? Like, what other books or pieces of media is this story in conversation with?
Oh my goodness, that is a great question. I think it would be on the shelf next to a DVD of 10 Things I Hate About You. It would be near the pieces of a DVD of the movie My Girl, which is a spoiler. Not really. There's conversation. Don't tell, if you know anybody who's in My Girl, don't tell them to read this book. And a copy of Pride and Prejudice would be there. And oh gosh, that's what I can think of right now. Those things.
I was also thinking Seven Things I Hate About You by Miley Cyrus, the iconic pop song.
Yes, that would be a good, oh
Mhm.
yeah.
I think it's just like a CD right there.
And like the Letters to Cleo song, I Want You to Want Me, because I feel like that's very, like, there's the vibe.
Well, just like speaking of music, do you have like a Spotify playlist? Like, was there any specific song that was on repeat when you were writing this?
You know, I usually have that, but for this book, because there was so much kind of hate involved, I would go back and forth between not writing with any music because there was just a lot of banter and snark. And then sometimes I would listen to Queen. I don't know why, but that was kind of, but I have a playlist, but it wasn't one I listened to very much. It was more for vibes after the fact where I'm like, yeah, this song is very much a hate song. It has now completely escaped my mind what any of those songs are. It's kind of like when someone asks you what your favorite book is, and then all of a sudden
I've
you
never read anything
no,
in my life.
never. Yeah, do I know how to read? Who knows? But yeah, I do have a playlist. I'll probably make it public at some point.
That actually leads well into my next question, which is, so someone here has picked up Fall for Him and they're ready to sit down with their perfect read. And what's the perfect situation? Like, what's the vibe they could set up? Like, obviously they're gonna have to find your playlist on Spotify after you post it. But besides that, like, do they need snacks? Like, where are they? Are they or like have a nice candle going? What's the situation?
Ideally, there would be some rain in the background. But in this case, it would be real rain. It would not actually be a harbinger of somebody falling through your ceiling. So it would be calming. And there would be some sort of large canine animal that you would have on the couch with you to warm your limbs while sipping on a warm, comforting beverage.
I love that. So start contacting your friends if you don't have a dog yourself and ask them to borrow it so that you're ready to go.
Very important.
Yeah. I'll just return to that opening really quickly and then before we move on. So there's also, a very well-placed "It's Raining Men" joke.
Oh, yes.
What inspired, I mean, also, like, let's talk about your first book. You love a disastrous meet cute.
I do.
I
do.
So what inspired this disastrous meet cute? How'd you come up with this idea?
Well, for this one, I knew that I wanted Derek to fall in love. And because when I put Fall for Him, or Fly With Me, my first book, in, my editor asked if I had any other book ideas. And she was like, and also like Derek. And I'm like, Derek? And she's like, yeah, Derek. So I'm like, okay. And then I wanted it to come with catastrophe. And then the "It's Raining Men" joke was how it started. A lot of times my books will sometimes start with a joke. And that was kind of, wow, this would be really crazy if this happened. It would be really, really insane if somebody just fell out of the ceiling and then landed on the bed. Imagine that. And I was dealing with some household issues myself at the time with water. And I'm like, this is the worst. What would make it a lot better, though, is if like a crush was right there and I ruined their life too. And then we had to solve all the problems together. I think that would make it better. So that's kind of how it evolved. And a lot of times when I write, I begin with a scene. So I start with that initial scene, that kind of setup where I either have a joke or some general idea or a catastrophe. And then I create the scene from that. And then it kind of evolves from there. And Derek, I was very familiar with him as a character. So I didn't need to reestablish his voice. I needed to start with Dylan so I could figure out what his voice was.
Kind of speaking about like the writing process of this book, I'm always really curious about like book one and book twos, because for a lot of the times, like usually if you're traditionally published, you kind of have as long as you want to work on your first book because that's like just you. And then like you are sending that out to an agent and then like it's been in your head and like on our computers for so long by the time we hopefully like get a book deal. But a lot of the times your second book is like the first one that you write under like deadline or under contract. So like, what was that process like for you? Was there anything different about your book one experience to book two in terms of your writing process?
It's hard because when you've been kind of like a querying author for a long time, and Fly With Me was my fifth book that I queried, my fifth like finished book. And I had been doing that for a long time. So I had been kind of working through, and I feel like Fly With Me was definitely when I was ready for that to happen. I was very, very lucky. There's always a lot of luck in publishing. It's kind of a combination of factors, but it's also persistence and privilege. And there's a lot of things that go into it. And you never know what's going to be your book. So I wrote Fly With Me, and I just felt like, okay, I think this is the book. And then when I started, I had one meeting with my publisher before I got the book deal, and they gave me some feedback, and then I went and revised, and I really wasn't sure what was going to happen with that. That could have ended there. I was fortunate that I ended up getting a 2-book deal, and they, in the process of before giving me that, they asked if I had any other ideas, and that's how the idea for the book came about. I just kind of sat down. I was like, okay, Derek. And then I sat down over like an hour and just wrote like a little pitch for it. And that's how the idea came up. And then once I got the book deal, everyone was like, how are you going to celebrate? I'm like, I don't know. It's COVID. So basically I sat on my couch and wrote Fall for Him in about 4 weeks after that. So I feel bad. I'm a little guilty because that process, though the book that I just finished writing recently makes me want to tear my hair out. So I feel like there's like a balance involved.
There's always one that you're like, this is the bane of my existence.
I feel like Susie and I have talked about that recently.
Yes, that is also
Yeah.
my 3rd book. Yeah. I was like, this is the sophomore situation that people tell me about. I just had it on the 3rd book. It was delayed.
Yeah, had the same thing because I wrote Made of Stars was my debut, which was a sci-fi, and then I actually wrote Every Time You Hear That Song while I was like still querying. So I had 2 full books ready to go. So my 3rd one was also the first one that I wrote on deadline.
Very different. And what was it like for you?
I wanted to tear my hair out.
Okay.
So the moral of the story here is that you're never safe. You may think
No.
like, oh, I'm past it. If any of you are writers, you're never safe. It's always miserable. Welcome.
But sometimes it's great. I mean, I
It's
wrote
so
my
fun.
I wrote my 4th book first. Yeah, 4th book first. And that one was fine too, because again, it was a character that I knew. But now it's the one that's going to be the 3rd book. You're never safe. It doesn't
And it's
matter.
also a fun thing about like nothing that you write, even if you shelve it, is like it doesn't have to be like dead. Like there are so many books that I'm like, I've shelved this, but like it could potentially be a book too. Or like so many authors down the line will like end up publishing a book that was their first book that they ever wrote, like years and years later. It's just
So
you never know what's gonna
fascinating.
happen.
And if you haven't read both of their books, you should, because they're excellent and they're just so good. Sorry, never miss an
Thank you,
opportunity.
Andy.
They are.
Thank you.
So also within kind of a craft question here, there are a couple different tropes going on in this book a little bit. Can you talk about the tropes and what you did with the tropes, if you intentionally included those tropes or kind of realized at the end, like, oh, forced proximity, here we are.
I love enemies to lovers, but I think that in a normal setting, I don't like it when people are really genuinely mean to each other. That makes me very uncomfortable. So I find this was an enemies-ish to lovers, where
A dislike to lovers.
Rivals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there's some meanness, there's some hating on each other, but I do feel like they never cross the boundary. Sometimes, when you cross the boundary into doing things that you can lose, I feel like you can lose the audience a little bit where you're like, okay, like, do I really want these people to fall in love? Because this seems a bit mean. And it's one thing in a fantasy where you're like, oh, you can be a little bit more morally gray. But I wanted both characters to have the best of intentions, but also have very strongly held emotions. But I still wanted it to involve some hate, because hate banter is just so fun. Why is it so much fun? It's just a delight. To just like write 2 characters that are constantly verbally sparring. It's just so much fun. And I feel like forced proximity is the other big one, because all of a sudden they're stuck in a small 1-bedroom apartment with a very, very large dog, and they have to make it work. And it's just such a delight to write, particularly as somebody with ADHD. And when the characters have ADHD, living with somebody who has ADHD has there's some humorous things that we can do, like cabinets, and they just stay open, glasses stay out. So it creates some opportunity for comedy.
Definitely. And just before Jen asks the next question, I do want to point out that if you'd like a visual for the very large dog, you can find him on the back cover. In case you haven't turned it over, I'm just obsessed with little Gus there.
He's based on my dearly departed dog. And when I did cover inspo for this book, it was like, here's a little bit on Derek, here's a little bit about Dylan, here's like 5 slides on my dog.
I was gonna ask if it was based off a real dog. This
yes.
is amazing.
My child earlier, when we finally got the final copies, they were like, this looks like Cusco. And I was like, yes, it does. So he's immortalized. So just know. Yeah.
I love that. Kind of sticking with the writing process theme, was there anything you kind of learned about yourself or your craft while you were writing this book?
I think with this book, grief is a big part of it. I talk about that a little in the author's note. And I think it's important when you write romance to kind of give readers going in, a little bit of information about what's going to happen in the book if you're going to discuss heavier themes. And I try to do that in the author's note, because when I was writing this book, my actual life was kind of falling apart. And so I had to figure out a way to find the romance, even though my life was sort of falling apart. And what I wanted to do in this book was also to show how characters could find the romance even when their lives are, in this case, literally falling apart in the floor, going out from under them. So in terms of what I learned about myself, it was that I can take these moments, find the comedy, and then find a way to make these characters feel lovable, even when they don't feel lovable. And I think that was a beautiful thing that I could kind of process through writing it.
I love that. That's so sweet.
It was a fun time, but there is kind of heavy stuff. So just FYI.
There is. And I think you write the most beautiful author's notes. I think in both of your books, it's something that really sets the tone for the book of saying like, things here won't always be easy, but like, that's okay. And we can go through that together. And, you know, it's like a very gentle intro, which I really appreciate.
Thank you.
I love that too, with like the promise of a happy ending, especially for like queer books as well. Like that's just, it's so comforting, and it's great to know that like that's where the ending is going.
Absolutely. Susie recently put a article out for Book Riot about queer happy endings and how sometimes you have to go about them a little differently because they just feel a little differently when you're writing them. And it was such a good piece, and everyone should check it out.
Thank you for the plug.
Sorry.
Appreciate it. So I also really love the home renovation aspect of it. Huge part of the book, obviously, because there's a giant hole in someone's ceiling that they're going to have to confront. But it's also, I mean, in your author's note, you mentioned that it is a metaphor for so much more. So can you talk a little bit about renovation as metaphor, as someone who also just turned in a book that involves a lot of renovation as metaphor?
I think when you're tearing down walls, you're like seeing what's underneath of them. And sometimes that's kind of a problem. And you wish that you never tore down the walls, because then you wouldn't know what was going on. And that there's kind of there's a situation in there where you can easily fall into this trap of being like, well, what if I had just left the walls up? And then I would know. And while mold removal is very expensive, it is good to know what is under the walls. And I think the same is true for when parts of our life are kind of collapsing, and sometimes it feels like this is the end of the world. And we really wish that none of this ever happened, but sometimes the beauty that can form from allowing something to completely collapse and sort of embracing that and being like, okay, well, now it's starting to collapse. I just need to tear the whole thing down. And allowing that to happen and kind of giving into the process versus fighting it, I think is something that I think a lot of us can resonate with, or at least I can resonate with in my life, is that sometimes when I'm fighting the things collapsing, it is harder on me. And in this case, in this book, they kind of both have to come together and solve this disaster and kind of rip it out. It's always going to look worse before it gets better. And I think that can happen as we're kind of evolving through life, and we are all growing. We're all in our own character arcs, and we can see how that kind of happens in our own lives. And home renovation it brings out the best and worst of us.
Speaking of home renovation, if the Property Brothers were in this book, what would their vision for the one-bedroom apartment be? Or like, what would their role in the story be?
Okay, I have a lot of feelings. This is being recorded. I may or
Property
may
Brothers
not
slander.
have a lot of feelings about the Property Brother.
This is a safe space. You can say them.
Is it though? Basically, they would be like, knock all the walls down, open floor plan. Yeah, so that's probably what they would do. They'd be like, knock them all down. We're gonna paint everything gray. But I haven't watched Property Brothers in 10 years. So when I was watching it, it was definitely in the millennial gray era, where it was rip everything down, make everything a little bit vaguely farmhouse and so that was not my vibe. So that's probably what they would have done. And that makes me sad.
Has anybody who's watched the Property Brothers in the past decade tell us if they've evolved?
I know. Please let me
Give us
know.
some
They
updates.
haven't? Oh, that's tragic.
Isn't one of them
That's so
married to
sad.
the new girl?
Yeah.
No.
Isn't there like a third secret property brother?
There's a secret.
Is there a
property
third
brother?
one who's not famous? You know, like the Hemsworths?
Derek, an audience member says they're named Derek.
That feels made up.
Not Derek in my book, though. Derek is
No.
not a property brother, just to be clear.
That would be a plot twist.
Wow. Okay.
Plot
This
twist.
is fascinating. On the same topic, this is not quite the Property Brothers. But what would Derek and Dylan's favorite HGTV shows be?
Ooh. Okay, Dylan, if he was watching any of the shows, he would pick them all apart. He would be like, no, wrong, incorrect. Because Dylan grew up with a contractor dad, and he was very against people who flip houses, home flipping. So I think he would almost not watch HGTV because so much of it is based on house flipping on principle. And he would be very frustrated anytime they did anything that was incorrect. But I think he might like a show that was there was an old show, and called Rehab Addict, where I think she goes in and preserves the overall, the beauty, the way the house was supposed to be versus coming in and kind of like ripping everything out. So I think he would appreciate a show like that. And Derek would like House Hunters because he would just criticize the people and be like, they're picking the wrong house.
But
And
you can't afford that house.
no, well, yeah, because it's always
it's like
like,
a public school teacher and like
Yeah.
and someone who's unemployed and they're like, our budget is $7 million.
right. And you're like, what? Yeah.
And this couple's going to get divorced next year because they
Absolutely.
obviously
Yes.
hate each other.
They can't
Yeah.
afford that mortgage payment.
No,
The only way to watch HGTV is
it is
criticizing the personalities of real people.
100%. I mean, it's like The Bachelor. The jobs that they have on The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, you're like, is that a job? It's like professional karma reader. And you're like, okay, but
I like all the ones who say that they're nurses, and I'm like, I don't know if you've ever set foot in an ICU. I'm call it. I don't know if that's true.
yeah, I get a little skeptical, but I am a nurse.
Do you watch The Bachelor or The Bachelorette?
Only when I'm with, I have a couple close friends. My best friend one of my best friends from like college, whenever I go and visit her in Kansas, we watch whatever reality television show she's watching. And last time it was Selling Sunset, I think.
Oh my God, I'm obsessed with Selling Sunset.
I hear
It's
there's
so
drama.
bad.
I hear there's drama, but no, I don't typically. I find it very stressful.
It is. They just had the finale, I think, for the latest season. I think it was the finale, and it was quite sad.
Somebody once asked me why I don't like reality television. And to me, it's like uncanny valley version of human interaction. It's like almost normal, but like
But
not
they know
at
they're
all.
being filmed. Yeah.
Yeah. And that makes me very uncomfortable.
This is not along the same lines at all, but I'm just kind of wondering which of your characters thinks that they just fell out of the coconut tree and which is like existing in the context. For both books, I'm curious.
Okay. Hard question. I think Olive probably maybe just fell out of a coconut tree. Dylan probably too. Well, but you see, it's hard because he literally fell.
Literally.
Yeah, he literally fell.
We'll
Yeah.
allow it.
And then Derek and Stella, they're on it. They get it. They're with the context. Mhm.
I love it. So I also want to talk about like the mental health representation in the book, which we touched on a little bit earlier, talking about your author's note. But can you tell us a little bit more about what it was important to you to include and what you hope readers take away from those characters and their mental health journeys?
I recently had someone reach out to me on Instagram who was talking about the grief journey that Derek goes on during this book. And that was very important to me to show grief in a way. It's not just in the moment grief. It can be grief that's removed from years and years, and it can be just as present with you if there's something that makes it present. And I think that that's something that we don't often see in books as much. Sometimes it's either the person has just died and they're immediately grieving. We don't see complex grief quite as much, particularly complex grief when it's a little bit more removed from the initial thing that happened, the initial loss. And what I wanted to show in this, it's something that has bared out in my clinical practice as a nurse. And grief doesn't always happen the way you expect it to. It's not an incremental process. And sometimes other people expecting it to be this incremental process can be troubling when you're inside of it, because you're like, no, I'm not there. And I was there yesterday. I'm not there today. And sometimes you can feel like this is something you're past. And then all of a sudden there's something else and you're like, ooh, wait a minute. I still need to process that. And that's all okay. And that can all happen when you're falling in love too, because that can all happen at the same time. And we tend, when we are falling in love, to learn new things about ourselves. And whenever we're in the process of learning new things about ourselves, we can have to reprocess things. And so that's kind of what I wanted to show in here as a representation of how grief can impact our lives far beyond what you would normally expect.
And then we also have Dylan's like ADHD journey as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that too while we're on it?
And that, I think I was getting, it's funny with Fly With Me, a lot of people talk about the character Stella as being very neurodivergent coded. And at that point, I didn't know that I was very neurodivergent coded. So I didn't rate her canonically as having like being an ADHD, like she definitely is, but in the same way that I am, and I didn't know it. But when I was writing Fall for Him, I was very aware that I had ADHD, and I was having to kind of you're kind of like post-morteming your life up until that point, and you're putting everything in a context. And so for Dylan, he was told for a long time that he was just kind of a mess. Because a lot of people with ADHD, that's what we're told is you're messy. You know, you're the kid that can't keep their desk clean. You're the kid whose room is always a disaster. It's always framed in a way, or often framed in a way that it's a problem that needs to be solved. But once you can figure out that you have this thing and you're like, oh, my mind just works differently. You spend a lot of time kind of reorienting yourselves around a bunch of events that happened in your life and having to go through. And in the same way that grief can cause you to reprocess things, that kind of diagnosis can cause a flavor of grief that's a little bit different. And so they're both going on similar journeys about very different things in the book and processing their lives in two different ways. And for Dylan, he's having to understand that even though he's got ADHD and he's got all of these things, that doesn't make him in any way less worthy of love. And that can feel like such a huge meteoric thing in the moment when you finally realize, oh, okay, wait, I'm not just a problem. I'm not just broken. I have wonderful parts about me and I'm worthy of love. And that's what I wanted to show in Dylan's character.
I love that. I'm also interested in your approach. We touched about this a little bit earlier about like your approach to writing queer romance and like queer happy endings. But a lot of the times queer romance stories don't necessarily follow the traditional like romancing the beat just because queer relationships look different. So kind of what is your approach to that, especially when, you know, we've talked about a book that has so much involved in it. You know, we talked about the mental health, we talked about the neurodivergence, like this is just another element of like being a person. Like what is that like for you to put that in books?
You know, I think it's lucky because Susie, you recently asked me this question about so I think more prepared than I would have otherwise been. But I think it's important with queer romance for you to also put your characters in a context where their happy ending is believable. And a lot of that ends up being found family. It ends up being in the community that you can see them in at the end of the story, where not only can you see them being happy together, but you can see them having a happy life. And that can mean very different things for queer people who live in a world where you might not, you know, where you have to look at the travel advisories to know if you can go on vacation and be a couple or not. So when you're writing a queer ending, you kind of have to always be aware of that. And because, you know, unless you want it to be sort of magical and mystical, but in the world that we live in, it's always something that we still have to be aware of. I hope that one day it's not going to matter. And I hope it's just another happy ending. But I don't think that's the world we live in yet. And so I think when I was trying to frame this happy ending, and same thing with Fly With Me, I wanted to also create the context and the found family that you can imagine these characters being with for the rest of their lives. And that can be a little bit broader, I think, than just two people kissing at the end of a book, which I love two people.
Love.
To be clear, I love that as well. But so sometimes I think that broader context for their happy ending can make it feel more real.
And actually, so I'm interested in the Burkeverse that we've seen so far in Fly With Me and Fall For Him. And I think that you show this like community that's part of your happy endings in this found family that you're talking about. But we do get to see Olive and Stella in Fall For Him. We also get to see some characters that are like common between the two books, and also potentially some characters that we might see in some future books. I don't know how much you can tell us about those. We can return to that at the end. But I do want to talk about your emotional support redheads. Is that what you called them to me at one point?
It is.
Okay, let's talk about that.
That would be Joni, and Dylan has a sister, which you meet later on in the book. And it's funny because I had two people in my life who were emotional support red. I mean, I'm also a ginger, just to be clear. But for a while, I had two other friends who were also ginger. And I was going through a lot. And I think at one point, one of us called us their emotional support redheads, emotional support gingers. And it was just like this thing. I don't know. It made me so happy. So I was really excited to put it in this book. And though that wasn't intentional exactly, I wrote Joni's story. Joni's a character who's also in Fly With Me. And she's also she's important in this book, and she's a redhead, but I had written her book actually first before I wrote Fly With Me. No one's wanted it yet. I don't know. We'll see what happens to it. It might just vanish into the vortex of the drawer that we authors keep books in. But then when the redhead who is new to this story popped up, she's very special to me as a character. And I wanted both Derek and Dylan to have somebody in their life that's both willing to call them on their bullshit, but also kind of really being their cheerleader in a way. And that's what the emotional support redheads do.
I think the secondary characters really shine in this novel.
Thank
It
you.
like really creates this whole world that I can't wait to see who we're going to see next in your third book.
Yeah, kind of like speaking about the universe that you're creating, the cinematic universe, if you will, and any future projects. Is there like something that you want? I mean, every book is different, but if someone picks up like an Andie Burke book, like what is something that you hope that they get out of it?
I hope, well, this is probably a little self-serving, but I do hope that people are okay with my books having a lot of humor and a lot of crying parts. But that's mainly because I recently came across a review. I don't read reviews, but it was kind of like a not again, and the implication was kind of about like, oh, this is supposed to be like a fun book, and then there was all this like sad stuff in it. And I was like, sorry, not really sorry. So I think that in terms of my brand and what I want, and brand is like such a weird word. Ugh. I want people to like laugh out loud when they read my books, and I hope that they do, but I hope that it does not in any way negate from the emotional resonant parts. Because what I've found is when I've been in situations where I'm scared, or when I've been as a nurse and, we're doing like pretty intense things, a lot of times you're like laughing with your colleagues, and you have to kind of keep that tone kind of back and forth. And I want that to shine through my books. I want them to be books that kind of whistle in the dark. And that's my hope.
I mean, I think you're doing a great job. What is life if not laughing through the sad bits?
I agree. I think that's how we survive the sad bits, is by finding the humor. And there's always a lot of comedy and catastrophe. So
Yeah. And I think there's room for all of that in romance. Like we definitely need and appreciate romances that are like all light fluff.
Yes.
We need and appreciate romances that are just like steamy as hell. But we also need the romances that will make you cry and like you come out of it feeling like you've learned something about like the human experience in that way. So I know that sometimes it can be like there's no one book that all readers can agree on. And I know that you don't read your reviews, but
I don't.
certainly anytime, like there's always going to be somebody who like wishes that there was less sad stuff in a romance, and there's always going to be somebody who wishes there was more sad stuff in a romance. And I think that you strike a really nice balance in what you do.
It's more that I don't want anyone to be blindsided, and in the sense that I don't want anyone going into it and being like, oh my gosh, like I would not have read this book if I knew. And that's why I really do try to put the author's note in the front. But I did get asked though about me if I'm just like a catastrophe romance, if that's just like my genre, like my subgenre.
What do you think?
I
What's
think
next?
yes. But I was thinking through the next few books, and I'm like, yeah, the next one's definitely it's a different kind of
It's
catastrophe.
like a list of natural disasters.
It's not, well, no, but yeah, there is definitely, I mean, I don't know. Is there a way to start a book without a catastrophe? I don't know.
It's like the beginning of the financial crisis in 2008. And
Oh God. It got so intense. No, as somebody who graduated in college in 2007, I'm not going back there.
I did see somebody get it was like an early 2000s rom-com that was pitched as like historical fiction.
No.
And I was like,
Sorry.
oh.
Sorry, I'll leave it home. That was a loud no. Yeah. It's like when people ask you, well, back in the, the 1900s. Okay. Yeah. Rude.
So I was refreshing. I read this book a while ago.
You did.
And then yes, which was wonderful. But I was refreshing myself on it and like speed reading through it before this event to make sure that I had all the details right. And I noticed that there are a lot of text conversations going on. So can you talk about what we can learn about a character through the way that they text and like why you choose to include that?
Oh, I loved adding the text. That was actually a later add. I think it wasn't in the first draft. There wasn't as much. I find the way we communicate with people when we're out of context to be incredibly illuminating about that person and about how they think about the other person. And when you have enemies-ish to lovers, there's a lot of passive aggressive stuff that's going to happen in text message. And it's really funny to think like, what would be the thing that would be so annoying that it would cause you to send a text message? And there's usually those things that tend to reveal what are the pet peeves what's going on in your head? Why did you send that text? And the texting style and the back and forth and the way when you can have good banter in text messages, you can feel the chemistry between like when you're texting your friends and you can have a back and forth banter, you just feel what that feels like. And it's a fun thing. So if you see the way the characters, even when they sort of hate each other, still can figure out a way to banter in text message, there's probably chemistry there. But I don't know, just my opinion.
I'm not going to ask you if you have a favorite character because I know this is such a hard question, but do you have a favorite scene or a chapter that like every time you wrote it, you were like, oh, I can't believe I get to work on this chapter?
Yes.
Please tell us about it.
Okay.
If you can.
Okay, I'm not going to spoil it exactly. There is a character in this book that may or may not poke a little bit of fun at people who are in multi-level marketing organizations. And but just might, and that person might be in a position of power in the greater authority of the place in which they live. And there's one particular scene involving local law enforcement that makes me laugh every time I read it, and which is, I feel like, very embarrassing because I did write it. So and there's the way that particular scene ends always makes me laugh. And I don't want to say more than that, but there's a back and forth. It's definitely like a little Abbott and Costello old style humor where everybody is like talking over each other and no one's really listening. And I love scenes like that. It was just a joy to write.
No, I think that's so important. I feel like sometimes there's like a scene in a book where like even if the book itself is like hard to work on, if there's like one chapter you're like, I did kind of eat with that. Like it's actually like good. And then like that's like kind of the thing getting you through like the dark revision.
Oh gosh, revision's just sometimes really hard. But if you find that humor and then you can hear the voices in your head, it can make it so much easier. That's a great question.
Yeah, I do love that. And there's definitely like a moment in the editing process, and usually it's with one of those chapters that you're like, oh, this is going to be a real book. This is like going to move out.
Maybe
of my
this is
brain.
good, I guess.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that happens to y'all too, because like I feel like that's something that we don't always talk about that much with other writers, where you're like, I don't know. Is this a book? Is this just, there might just be a collection of words. I'm really not sure if it's a book or not. But then sometimes there's a magical feeling.
Yeah, I feel like the second book I published, I think was the first time that I was like, I'm very proud of this. And I think it's a good book. And like, I think a lot of the times though, like when you're a writer, you can probably like speak on this too. A lot of it is like, you're so uncertain and there's so many people who are like telling you no all the time that it's like very hard to be like confident in your own craft. And it's a lot of like internal work to be like, actually, I think I do have things to say. And also that's just like, I mean, you have to have a certain level of arrogance to think that. And
Delusion.
yeah, delusion. You're so right. You have to be a little delusional in this.
There's no way to be an author without being a little bit delusional. Because somehow, I don't know, it's against a lot of odds.
And it's also strange because so much of what we do is very isolated, that it's just us sitting with our blinking word processing, whatever we use. And like, it's very easy to think that like your experience of feeling like, oh, this book is trash and everyone's going to hate it and I'm a failure is like just you. And I think that every single author goes through that experience. But
That's
then
comforting.
Yeah. But then what makes it magical is when like you get to this point and it is out and readers start reading it, and then it starts to feel very bizarre for a moment. But how does that feel different for you now? How are you feeling now versus when Fly With Me came out?
I think it's about the same. I was listening to Lainey Rose introduce my book so lovelyly. And I turned to, and I was like, oh, weird that we write books. Like, I don't know. I'm here. I'm in a bookstore and there's books on the shelf, but it has not gotten less weird. And I don't know if it will, but it still blows my mind every single time that I find out that somebody has read it. It's these moments in my brain where, again, because I was querying for years and years with multiple manuscripts, and I was getting very accustomed to being like kind of like a writer that was never going to make it. Like I was just going to be the writer, the hobby writer, collecting books, and so that this is just this paradigm shift, and my brain hasn't caught up at all. It's still bananas.
I do remember thinking as a kid that like authors weren't like real people. Like the books just kind of appeared there. So like to me, I was like, well, author's not a real job you can have. Those aren't people.
Oh, that's so funny. I mean, that kind of is true because we think of authors so much in terms of what they do. We don't really think about them, particularly for kids' books and stuff. We think about their books. That's so much who they are in our brains. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, definitely. So also, let's see, we have about 5 minutes till we're going to turn to audience questions to start brewing. Nursing. I don't know that I actually have a question here, except to say,
Elaborate.
I love nurses.
Yay.
My mom's a nurse. I know I was with you for your first book when we were here at East City Books. And we talked about this because also Olive is a nurse and Derek is a nurse. So this kind of like nursing family within the Burkeverse is very important. But there's also some like kind of important moments with Derek's experience as a nurse in this book. Can you talk a little bit about bringing like life as a nurse to romance?
When you read the dedication, it's dedicated to healthcare workers who are the victims of violence. And I think a lot of people are very unaware how dangerous being a healthcare worker is. And the way I have approached both of these books is to not, this isn't Grey's Anatomy, this isn't ER. We're not like seeing them necessarily in their scrubs doing their like nurse jobs. The thing about being a nurse is that you're like a nurse all the time. Even when you leave work, a lot of work comes home with you. And sometimes we bring injuries home with us. And I was an ER nurse for during the pandemic, and I've been a nurse over a decade, lots of different units, and they're seeing multiple different sort of dangerous situations. And I've seen so many pretty horrific injuries to healthcare workers. And I wanted to show this in a way that wasn't gratuitous and wasn't like for shock value. And so when something like that happens in the book, the way it's treated is the way we nurses treat it, which is, yeah, that was crazy. That was just a thing that happened yesterday. And I'm gonna go back tomorrow. Like that's how it feels when you're in the moment. And that's what I wanted to show here because it doesn't, when you're in it, it's so normal, and it is not okay for it to be as normal as it is. But when you look up and I have a number somewhere in the dedication about how many healthcare workers are victims of workplace violence every year, that number is catastrophically high and it should be lower. And one of the things that as I went into writing these books was heavy on my kind of like brain and heart was wanting to show that and how it feels in the moment and kind of make it seem so normal that the audience is like, what the fuck? Like you just came home with, an injury and you're just like, oh yeah, it's like a thing. Because most people, when they go to their jobs, if they came home like beat up, they'd be like, oh my gosh, I got beat up. But nurses, a lot of times you're just like, yeah, I came home, like, I got scratched, I got bit. It happens a lot to a lot of different teachers. Like this can be a problem. So it's something I wanted to illuminate a little in this text without making it play for shock value. Like it's not that shocking to Derek. And that's kind of what I wanted to show. Because being a nurse, I don't know, you kind of have to, it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. And he's an ER nurse, and ER nurses, you just never know what the hell is going to come right in the door.
That's actually really interesting because I mean, a lot of writers have a 9 to 5 and then have to write separate from that job. But I have a friend who's a PA too. So like in an ICU, but also writes these like beautiful, lovely rom-coms in a way that I'm like, how do you, like, I don't know, is it compartmentalizing? Like, is there a mindset shift when you have to, go from one part of your life to another? Or, I mean, obviously there's a lot of influence and carry over into both because it's probably impossible to separate the parts of yourself.
I think a lot of healthcare workers who write and are readers, we tend to bring a lot of the inspiration that we get from seeing really human, profoundly human moments. And I think whenever you work in healthcare, you're going to see these big moments that we talk about a lot that kind of get shown on screen in a lot of media, but you see them in a different way. They're in some ways, they're your everyday, which is a kind of bizarre way to live. You're seeing the worst and best moments of people's lives, but you still have to go home and make your kids dinner. In my case, I usually have to make my kids dinner because they like eating. And so in terms of compartmentalization, like I've got my nurse life right now. I work 2 days a week. I have to be transparent about it. People don't think I'm like working full time and doing this. I will sometimes see like pretty awful things or like I do sedated MRIs right now at a children's national location. And but it's a beautiful job and I love my job so much, but you do carry it home with you. Because if you're an empathetic person, how could you not in a little way? And sometimes the things that I process from work, I process through writing, but they're not processed on the page in a very concrete way. It's not like I see a case and then I come home and write about it. It's more the feelings involved in that informs my writing and informs my general overall understanding of how humans deal with stress and how humans deal with these big moments. And that's the same as true in terms of being a mom and being a writer. You kind of like all of those things play together for a human understanding the world. And you see a different side of it as a nurse.
Well, thank you so much for what you do as a nurse and for like bringing that onto the page, because everything that I know of my nurse friends, and it's like, that really is the experience. And I think it's really beautiful to show like Derek going through that, but also coming home at the end of the day and like being like loved and taken care of, and like finding a way to process that is really beautiful to see. Let's see, we accidentally brought that real heavy before we move into audience questions.
Anyway.
So before that, let's talk about something exciting. What's coming next? What can you tell us?
Okay, so I told them beforehand that I didn't actually ask my publisher what I was allowed to share. So I'm just like, better.
Again, this is a safe space.
Better to ask forgiveness than permission. But so basically I've got 2 other books under contract, and the next one's going to be a sapphic, but I wrote the 4th one before I wrote the 3rd one. So unless something changes, the 3rd one's going to be a sapphic, and the 4th one is going to have a character. Don't tell my publisher. That is very important in this book, and I suspect you will be able to tell which character.
Is it a character that I messaged you about while I was reading the book to be
I
like,
believe so.
okay, great.
I believe so.
I agree.
Yes. And that is the 4th book because there's time that takes place. So I'm very excited. The 3rd book did make me want to pull my hair out, but it is a beautiful story and I'm really excited about it. And I'm hoping it'll come out next fall, but we'll see. Yeah, it's exciting.
Yay, amazing.
So what questions do y'all have for Andie or for any of us?
So you mentioned that you didn't know you were going to write a book about Derek when you wrote Fly With Me. How did Derek change as a character as you started to dive into him? How did his story evolve? Even him as a person?
Derek, I started writing about him when I wrote Joni's story. So he had been in my brain with a voice for a very long time by the time I got to this story. So in some senses, he was very well established, but I didn't know anything about him. Kind of like a colleague at work where you're like, oh, I know what joke that colleague's going to make. So you like know you've got their voice in your head, but you might not know like who their family is. And I didn't know, it took me a while for me to understand. Like I knew little bits and pieces. And then when I write, because I am a pantser, I'm not a plotter, I tend to have an idea and some general theme things, but then I just sort of write and make the characters make each other angry or banter, and then story kind of comes from there. And to me, it feels like I'm just kind of peeling back pieces and I'm like, oh, there's something that they're really upset about. And if I keep writing, then I'll figure out what that is. And so the more I keep writing, sometimes it just happens where it would be like if you were meeting somebody and you finally find out their backstory. That's how it feels. So a lot of times it doesn't happen super consciously. And then I found out little pieces of him, like what his family was like, what their vibe is, what's going on. And then I kind of had to go in deeper and see, okay, well, how would this be reacting to Dylan and Dylan's situation? Because I want their situations to be different. And then that helped me create Dylan's voice too, as I started to explore Derek. And I knew that I wanted Derek to have more like Capricorn energy and just a little bit, more like he's got all of his ducks in a row in a way that Dylan doesn't. And because you want them to be foils as well. So it helps to kind of get to know that one character so you can kind of know how you want them to react to each other. And then as I kept writing, that's kind of what happened. Just found little things out as I went along.
And for our virtual audience, the question on that was having like been asked to write a book about Derek when he was a character in the first, but not really going in like what that was like. You probably figured that out, viewers at home. But I'll try and do better about that. All right. Other questions?
Hi, I have a question. I know you said one of the characters is PhD and what's not. Are there any other pieces of yourself that you?
Question was like what pieces of yourself did you put into the characters in the books? We know nursing among other things. Yeah, does that cover it? Okay.
Dylan's sister's a redhead. She has a temper. And a part that I had a question about, and I think it comes up early, so it's not really a spoiler, is that concept of like kind of being the teased one in a family, like the one who sometimes is the teased one, where maybe there's like a lot of family jokes like at your expense, and like what that kind of like leads to you growing up as. That's like more of like a experience that I've had, not in my family is fine, but in taking that to see what that would mean as somebody with ADHD and how you kind of can impact those feelings of brokenness inside of you when you get them from when you're young. Dylan is also a software engineer, and I grew up with a mom who's a programmer, and she was into computers the whole time. So I love bringing those kind of things in. And I'm trying to think of anything else. Oh, the dog. It's really Cusco, but it's Gus in the novel. So that was my dog. So
We love Gus.
me too. We do. But thank you.
All the way in the back.
Hi, Kelly. Oh, God. This is a mistake. I know. Sorry, those of you online, we'll tell you the question in a second.
The question was, how much did astrology play into building the characters? Did you think about the astrology or plan any of that in?
It is very important that Susie is sitting right next to me.
I
for
was
the
just gonna
question.
say, our astrology expert.
Yes, because Susie has been instrumental into my understanding of astrology. So no, I used to Enneagram my characters a little bit because the Enneagram is useful for like, what are you most afraid of? What's the worst version of yourself look like? I find that was very effective. Now that I know more about astrology, it's very helpful too. But I was raised evangelical, so it was all evil and Satan. So now I'm getting into it. But it's been like a process. So I'm like figuring it out and it's really fun now. So no, I didn't. But now in the book that I'm currently writing, it's such a problem because I'm like, no, her birthday can't be then. She is a Libra. It's actually a problem now.
What's
I-
your sign?
I'm a Leo
Hmm.
sun and I'm a Taurus moon and a Sagittarius rising.
I'm a Sagittarius sun.
Fire signs.
Oh my gosh, I know it's so much fun, right?
Yes. Susie is a Gemini.
I am a Gemini. Yeah, I'm sorry about it.
It's okay.
I do my best. I think that if you're aware of the villain that you are in the zodiac, you can better work with your negative traits and try and.
But if you are interested in astrology, you have to read Susie's book that just came out because basically somebody goes on a bunch of online dates with all the zodiac and it is phenomenal.
Thank you. Looking for a sign.
Yeah,
Fun.
that's the title.
Are you an astrology girly, Jenna?
I lived with one of my best friends for 4 years who was an astrology girly, and I learned so much from her. I was gonna say I do have to do my character's big three for
Okay.
every book that I do.
Do you?
I don't necessarily start there.
Okay.
Sometimes I'll figure it out later. Sometimes it does cause problems with birthdays, and you're like, oh,
Yeah,
wow.
I did have to think about that. Well, because every time you hear that song was the first book I read that took place in like real world where I had like
Also great.
a full
Read that book.
calendar. And so I was like, well, this is when her birthday is. So she has to be a Taurus. And I was like, well, luckily that worked out. But like, yes, you have to really think about real dates.
You do.
You can't just do vibes.
No.
Yeah. But I think even if it's not something that you know a ton about or not something that you really believe in, it is kind of a helpful tool in character building of thinking about a character's motivations and how they may be different from your own, thinking about like what's really important to them and ways that they may be different from the other characters in your book. It's like kind of helpful for adding some texture and layers just to think about those things, even if it doesn't have to be astrology, but like you have to have some kind of form of way of saying like, how am I going to think about the way that these characters look at the world and how it's not all the same way.
I find it good for conflict too, or be like, how would,
Yes.
especially in a relationship or also just like in general, like how would this person handle conflict versus like this person? And again, whether it's astrology or not, like those are just things that I find helpful to know about my characters.
Absolutely. I think it shows you like what they want in any given moment and what they're worried about. It can be so helpful. But the Enneagram is also good for that if you're looking at the character stuff.
Any other questions?
Great question.
Still got a few minutes.
Okay, so you don't like your characters being mean to each other, but as you're writing this book, how have you found that being a hater is
So Andie doesn't like her characters being mean to each other, but how can being a hater be helpful?
I find being snarky and sarcastic and having very helpful. And I think that, yeah, I'm a redhead with a temper. So sometimes my internal monologue is kind of a hater. It's very helpful because you can see, and it's also just fun to write the thing because it's a book. So you get to like say the haterific thing and it's really fun. And it's a delight to be able to like point out those moments of like, I'm just gonna like pick at you a little bit in a way that is so fun sometimes, particularly when it's comedy and particularly when it can create these absolute delightful moments of hijinks. It's really fun. I highly recommend just having a little bit of hater inside of you.
I too am hooked on enemies to lovers romance. And it's very tough to write. Part of kind of my third book as well, because like it's very tough to write these characters in a way that they genuinely are mean to each other and then they come around and kind of earn your trust and each other's trust. But it gives you so much room for like that character growth arc that you go from hating each other to loving each other. That's such a wild swing that you get to the satisfaction of that journey. I think is part of what makes it such a delicious trope. And also that like, I love the internal turmoil of like, oh, I want to hate this person, but they're so hot. God damn it. Like, I love that. I think that it makes for such a fun journey of the book. What do y'all
I
think?
really love the moments where they're like, do I really want to beat the shit out of you, or do I just want to do other things? That's a great energy for a scene. What do you think?
No, I agree. I also think that like the reason why I'm sometimes so hit or miss on enemies to lovers is because I do think it's very genuinely hard to write in a way that you were talking about. Like, is this guy just mean to you? Like, okay, that's just like dating in DC. Like, why is that? Like, that's just so normal. Like, there needs to be such a genuine reason why they're enemies. And sometimes if the reason is like very genuine, then you're like, okay, well then like, why are they falling in love? So I think there's such a fine line to like walk that I think also in contemporary romance, when people are like, it's enemies to lovers, and he's like, don't touch her, that's my wife. I'm like, this is a guy named Brad who works in finance. Like, please stop with the dramatics. Like,
I
enemies to
agree.
lovers in contemporary is also a hard sell for me because I'm like, who is genuinely enemies with someone in real life?
Yeah, I mean, I personally have nemesis, but they're not.
They don't know about it.
Right. They don't. They're usually one-sided.
It's my hater. It's the inner hater
Yeah,
who's like
The
this person.
hater. Yes, you got to have like, the checkout person that's always really slow, but somehow you end up in their line. Nemesis.
Or like it's like a workplace enemy, but I'm like, I don't want to kiss you. I'm just so aggravated with
Yeah.
everything you do right now.
Yes, I agree. No, that makes total sense. It
But
is,
then I think when you find a good one, it's really, really good.
but probably not Brad in finance.
No, never date a
No
Brad in
offense.
finance
No
or a
offense.
consultant.
No offense.
Sorry to the Brads in the audience.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Do we have any online questions?
There's one, which is, what books are y'all reading right now? Or if you've been reading.
I just finished Jenna's book. And it's a delight. It's so good.
Same. It's so good.
So good. So good. If you've ever loved like kind of that like Dolly, but it's not Dolly. It's not Dolly, but it's not like, but that like country old like Hollywood story that you're like, ooh, what was the gossip? But then like it's a YA and it's tremendous. And I just enjoyed it so much. And Jenna, you did such a beautiful job of those emotional resonant moments. And it was just a delight to read from start to finish.
Oh, thank you.
So-
Wow.
Yeah, that's the one I just read.
Yeah.
What else are you reading right?
I didn't read super recently, but it Here for the Wrong Reasons. We were talking about The Bachelor earlier, so it feels important to bring it up that I adore that book. I personally hate The Bachelor. I'm sorry, I'm going to out myself right now. I really hate The
That's actually
Bachelor.
that's a normal take to have,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, so I really despise it, but I read the book and I was asked to blurb it. So I was reading it and I was like, I'm going to hate this book and I'm going to say no. And then I started reading it, I was like, oh no, I really like this book. So even if you're not a Bachelor fan, it really wins you over. It's about two contestants, one of whom knows that she's queer and is going in specifically just to get followers, and the other one who does not realize that she's queer and is going in looking for love, but they fall in love with each other instead of with the male contestant. And it's written by a couple who are together because they met over their shared love of The Bachelor, which is so cute.
That's so
That's
cute.
adorable.
I really love that one.
Wow. I did do the thing where I was like, do I know how to read? And I was like trying to cycle back. I was like, I know that I read The Pairing by Casey McQuiston this month or last month. What month is it? In August.
Wait, show of hands. Have anybody else read in the audience The Pairing yet? A couple. Okay.
I loved it. I thought it was great. I read Lady Macbeth by Ava Reid. And then I'm currently reading an arc of a new YA, like dark gothic fantasy called This Raging Sea that's going to come out next fall. A little blurb.
Yeah, we're gonna have to wait a while for that.
I know, I'm so sorry to tease it, but it is quite good.
That's the problem when you ask authors, like, because it's like, oh, this book is so great. I don't even know if I can tell you the title yet. Like we're awful for recommendations.
True. That's true.
Oh, but Hot Summer, if you also like queer.
Oh my God, I was
sapphic.
looking at that one. Do you
Oh,
recommend?
it's so good.
Okay, I've heard
Highly
nothing but good
recommend.
things.
I blurbed that one, Hot Summer. It's great.
All right. It is exactly 8:00 on the dot.
Oh, we
Lainey
did
Rose
so
looks
good.
like she's tired of listening to us. That means that we're done. Thank you. I will say first, thank you so much to East City Bookshop, which is an amazing store, and we are so lucky to have it here in DC. They do amazing things for the book community, hold really wonderful events, many of which Lainey Rose plans. And before you leave, maybe buy like 20 more books on your way home.
That'd be great. We would love that.
Your TBR could take it.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight, both in person and to our virtual attendees. We're going to take like probably 5-10 minutes to just reset the space, bring out a table for our lovely authors to sit and sign it. All 3 of their books are upstairs at the register. Please buy all of them. And we will get the table set up very shortly. If you are willing and able to set your chair off to the side so that we can come by and collect them, we appreciate that. But if not, thanks so much for being here.
And thank you so much to Susie and Jenna for being my conversation partners. They're
Love it.
amazing. Sorry, just wanted to make sure. You're the best.